All right, everyone, welcome. Great to have you all here. My name is Sadel Turbovsky. I'm the CEO and co-founder of OpenGrants, and super excited to be hosting this webinar about unlocking America's seed fund. And we have Ben Schrag here with us. As people trickle in, I just want to cover a few housekeeping things as we get started. So you're in the right spot if you're here to learn about unlocking America's seed fund. If you are not here for that, stick around. It's going to be super cool. We're going to talk about how you can secure non-dilutive funding for your startup. In fact, it doesn't take up any place on your cap table. You don't have to pay it back. It's a super exciting program and a great way to partner with an incredible institution. So we will be using the Q&A tool exclusively to ask questions today. So as you are feeling sparked to inquire about something in particular, please use the Q&A tool. Otherwise, you can reach out if you have any issues support-wise to our team. But yeah, really excited to have you all here. We're going to go ahead and dive right in. I'm going to just introduce myself. My name is Sadel Turbovsky, as I mentioned, founder and CEO of OpenGrants, and we are the easy way to win grant funding. I'm super excited to be joined by Ben Schrag. He's the SBIR and STTR Program Director and Policy Liaison at America's Seed Fund, NSF. And Ben, if you would take a moment just to introduce yourself, a bit of your background and what your role is there.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Thanks to Dale and to your team for the invitation, the opportunity. So yeah, I am currently part of the National Science Foundation. We're a federal government agency that funds mostly basic research, and I work in part of the foundation that supports non-dilutive funding, R&D funding to deep technology startups. So my role here, and there's a dozen program directors who have the same role, is to try to do outreach and bring in great deep technology companies to evaluate them based on merit and impact, to support them with funding of up to $2 million each in phases, and to work with them to help them be successful. So I've been in this role for 13 years here at NSF. And prior to NSF, I was actually at a startup doing a semiconductor diagnostic tool for 7 years, which was spun out of my graduate work. I got my degrees all in physics and studied physics and materials science as my technical background.
Awesome. That's one of the things that always excites me about NSF in general, is that everyone there is just like really solid in terms of being very, very smart and intelligent and subject matter experts in a variety of spaces. I'm going to launch a quick poll. Folks who are joining us would love to hear how y'all are doing today and what your biggest challenge might be related to fundraising. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll before we dive into our full discussion today. Would love to get y'all's thoughts about just generally the vibe out there, how folks are doing, and learn a little bit more about your challenges related to fundraising. As Ben mentioned, the NSF program is super exciting. There is an entire team of folks who have subject matter expertise across a broad array of technologies and disciplines, and I'm super excited to dive in. We're going to just kind of get started with like, what is NSF and what are the things that you're interested in funding there. Feel free, once again, just as a reminder, use the Q&A as we start talking. We will have time for some Q&A and kind of open discussion towards the end of the webinar today, and this will also be recorded so that you can check it out later. But seeing those questions roll in on the poll, sounds like a lot of folks are excited to learn. Other folks looking for some midweek inspiration, which is totally warranted. There's a lot of interesting things going on in the world right now, some really great, some not so great. And the biggest challenge out there sounds like about finding the right funder. And so we are definitely going to talk about that, about whether or not NSF is a good fit for you, and whether or not, this is the program that might be the one for your startup in particular. So really thank you all for sharing your thoughts. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and I will share those results with folks so you can check that out. But yeah, let's dive into it, Ben. I'd love to hear, just kind of to get started, like to baseline it for folks. What is NSF, and what do y'all like? What kind of funder are you? What do y'all like to fund?
Yeah. So to your question about what is NSF, so again, we are a part of the federal government. We're a government agency, and we're called a funding agency. And what that means is that the purpose of NSF, the entire existence, is about allocating funding, right? So we don't have, we are all, as I mentioned, and as you mentioned, Sadell, we're all scientists and engineers by training, most of us, but we're not doing science and engineering while we work here. We're actually helping to allocate resources for science projects, research projects, engineering, things like that. So our agency has about an $8.5 billion budget. And about 93% of that funding comes to us from Congress and then goes back out of the foundation in the form of awards. So most of them are grants, some of them are contracts, and most of them are for basic research. So most of the time, NSF funding is intended for somebody who wants to learn about the universe. Biologists, geologists, astronomers, they apply for funding to do certain research projects, to answer certain research questions. We put them all through a rigorous peer review process, and we try to fund the most promising projects. And so again, most of that is basic research where the goal is, let me just figure out something about the universe without any specific application or use in mind. The SBIR program, which many of you have heard about, that's Small Business Innovation Research, that is basically a small part of NSF, which is doing a slightly different kind of research. And so our goal, and this is a congressionally mandated program, is to also provide research funding, but we're doing it for a different reason. We're doing it to help companies, small businesses, develop new products and services, specifically ones that require technical R&D to develop. So typically new engineering projects, new engineering innovations, new scientific discoveries that might be able to translate into a product that has commercial impact. So that's kind of the basic idea of what we do here. We are the federal government. We do this at scale. So our budget is about $230 million just in the small business programs where I work. And so that means that at any given time, we're providing funding to between 700 and 900 small businesses across the country and across the broad spectrum of technologies and industries. And so one of the things to know about our program is that unlike, I think, every other agency that runs this program, we don't have any topical focus. We're not looking for any specific kind of technology. We're not looking for any specific product. We're looking for a specific kind of company, which is early stage startups, typically pre-seed stage startups, with very disruptive technology with high technical risk that have potentially seriously scalable commercial impacts, meaning, big commercial wins. That's the type of thing we look for. I think I might have missed one of your questions, Sadell, so if I did, please ask it again.
That was great. That's a great overview. I want to zoom in on a couple things that you mentioned that I think are really important. And that is that I love that you talked about, NSF at large is this agency that funds incredible kinds of research. You talked a lot about hard tech, and I do want to answer one question I saw come in that I think is relevant. Does NSF, just in general, are they also interested in social sciences? Like, do y'all fund things like social and like psychological studies, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so we definitely do. We do fund any company where the conduct of research and development, typically that is technical research and development, is a critical thing that stands between them and the next stage of viability, right? So many times, social science is usually not the core of what we pay for, of the type of activity we pay for, but we have lots of companies where the underlying innovation might be based on new innovations in social science. For example, we have companies, a lot of companies now doing educational technology, especially in the social and emotional learning, SEL, which is a big focus right now, and that's obviously heavily grounded in social sciences. And in those companies, we tend to fund them to try to figure out ways to build algorithms, for example, around that, or other ways to create scalable products based on innovative approaches where there is research and development required. So it's not the biggest part of our portfolio, but there's definitely some of that we do.
Awesome, very cool. So I wanted to mention that and then zoom in a little bit and note that, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I did want to make the distinction that NSF is an agency. They do a lot of research, development, funding of research and development. And then there is America's Seed Fund, which is the brand that is built around the NSF SBIR program.
Yeah.
Federally mandated program that we're talking about today, which is focused on the early stage startups. So I wanted to draw that distinction for folks.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, the entrepreneurs among us can think of that as a DBA, right? That's kind of our DBA for the SBIR program.
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. And so SBIR, we talked a little bit, you mentioned like primarily looking at programs with technical risk. And this is kind of one of the things I wanted to break down for folks, because it's a conversation that we have a lot where people say, hey, we submitted this SBIR proposal and it got rejected because of X or Y, or we just want to know if this program is a good fit. And so there is language about kind of like an interest in technical risk. And I'd love if you could just kind of describe or talk a bit, speak a bit to that. Like, what is technical risk?
Yeah.
What does that mean? And like, how much risk are you actually looking to fund?
Yeah, that's a great question, because this idea of having enough technical risk and technical innovation is kind of the flip side of that. So I'll talk about both of them together. But that aspect of a company is the single biggest reason why a particular startup is not a good fit for us. That is the thing that makes most companies actually not a good fit for our funding, because there's a lot of great small businesses that don't actually need to rely on a risky product, which is great. If you all have a company and you have a path to commercial viability that doesn't require technical risk, you should take it, because technical risk is not something you ask for. It's something you have to deal with if you happen to be cursed or blessed with that kind of product. And so the way we think about this is, technical risk for us is basically when you have an idea for a product or service that, even given a really qualified team to build that out, to develop it, there is still a good chance that something about the laws of nature or of the universe makes it possible that that product or service can never be built the way it needs to be built for your customer. So there is an existential risk, not in terms of your company failing, which there always is, but there's an existential risk just to being able to make the product work at all. That's kind of the type of technical risk that's the way we would boil it down. And so again, it's very important to distinguish that from a market risk. It's not a risk that nobody's going to buy your product. It's not a risk that you can't kind of build a margin in that you need to. It's literally a risk that, like, I can't even give you the product because I can't make it work. And so our program not only tolerates that kind of risk, we require it. It's a requirement. And the reason we do that is because we're trying to fit in and make an impact as big as possible. And one of the places that the private sector historically has not been perfect at supporting is, first of all, anything that has a technical innovation involved at all, because there's long timelines and large capital requirements. But also, that technical risk is something that investors in the private sector typically don't want to pay for. They don't want to take that risk. They don't want to wait as long as it takes, and they're not comfortable with these kind of very technical products. So that's kind of the place where we think we can have the biggest impact. The way to think about technical risk, and again, technical innovation is kind of the flip side of that. It's hard to define it, but the best way I think for people to understand it is that there's a few characteristics of the kinds of companies that are good fits that you don't have to have all of them, but if you're a good fit, you probably have many of them. And so what those things are is, again, number one, as I mentioned, you have a product where you're not sure how to make it work yet, and you're not sure, and nobody's done anything like it, so that you don't have a roadmap to making it work. You have to figure that out. Number two, if it works, it provides some kind of pretty disruptive competitive advantage or feature that is not possible with other products in the market. So some compelling value proposition to your customer. Number three, if it works, if you can build it, it's something that you can stop other people from replicating. It's something where you can build a barrier to entry for competitors. Sometimes that's a patent, sometimes it's trade secrets, but basically you can make an argument that the next qualified team in your space can't just knock off what you're doing, right? And so those three things are typically the hallmarks of the type of companies we look for. You don't have to have all three of them, but if you don't have any of them, it's likely that what you're working on is not a good fit, right? So the thing that makes your company special, it might be other things, but for companies that we fund, the thing that makes your company special has to be a new way of doing things that is still, at least when you apply for funding from us, that is still TBD, uncertain and unproven.
Awesome. No, that's a great description and very clear. I really appreciate it. And I am seeing all the questions come in. We will get into those, I promise, folks. But I want to touch on, so we've kind of discussed, like, is this a good fit? And like, is it fair to say that kind of technical risk and those metrics you just mentioned, those are a really good barometer by which to judge if your company is a good fit for this program. Is that fair?
That's one side. That's probably the rarest characteristic that we look for in what's a good fit for us. There is, though, also another category that I think is much less mysterious and much more common, which is that we all look for companies that have the same, characteristics commercially and team-wise as any investor, right? We're looking for committed, passionate, gritty teams who, see that this is what they need to do. This is what they're going to focus all their efforts on for the next, it could be 10 or 12 years in our case. We're looking for some sense of customer traction, customer discovery, possibly, it's a sense that, you can actually solve a problem and you've started to talk to the people whose problem you're solving. And then all the other aspects that any early stage investor looks for, right? So structure of the company, advisors, things like that. So I think our kind of rubric for a good fit is that technical piece that we talked about, plus the commercial and team vision and approach that I think many private sector investors look for.
Awesome. So kind of to the TLDR on that might be to say that like you're looking for the same things that a lot of investors are, but also you're willing to take on a risk profile that just, a lot of other VCs won't.
Yeah, I think that's right. And again, we're willing to take on risk in lots of areas, but that technical risk we have to have. We're not willing to take on, we're not willing to not take on risk on the technical side, right? So the idea is if your company can tell me for sure, if we have enough money and time, we can make this product work. If you know that for sure, you're probably not risky enough for us.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, that's great. I wanted to touch on those aspects just in terms of finding fit. And then before we dive into all the Q&A, because there's a lot of questions stacking up, I wanted to mention or get your like overview on kind of the logistics of this program, because there's a phase 1, there's a phase 2, there's other contracts and grants in the SBIR space. Can you just describe kind of logistically what the approach, kind of like typical pathway is for a company that, all right, they're a fit, they pass through peer review, and they have like, what's the time frame look like? What's that process look like for once you've said go NSF and the company, they're like ready to roll. What happens next?
Yeah, sure. So let me talk. I'm only going to talk about NSF. I mean, every agency, there's a lot of SBIR programs, and there's some commonalities between them, but the practicalities can be very different. I will say that for NSF, I would really focus folks on the phase 1. You have to do that first, and there is a phase 2 funding. And so the phase 1 is a $275,000 grant, and the phase 2 is $1 million award. Phase 2 is something you probably don't need to worry too much about. Now it would happen typically a year or two after your phase 1 starts. But for NSF, the phase 1 has kind of 2 steps, and one of them is called the project pitch. That's the first one you have to do. It's very lightweight. It's submitted through our website anytime as a portal. It's kind of a 2-pager on, again, all the kind of key DNA about your company, and then specifically what are these kind of big technical risks that you need our funding to address. And so that submission is about 1,000 words. And again, you would send it to our website, and that is intended for you to figure out this question of whether you might be a good fit. So we'll take a look at it. We'll typically respond within a week or two, and you'll get feedback from the program director, who would actually be the person who would fund you if you move forward. So that project pitch is something that I think is, for those who are not sure that they're a good fit, that we've created that to kind of answer that question in a slightly more formal fashion. So that step would be the first step. Good.
If I may, I just want to say that this is an incredible feature. One of the reasons I'm a big fan of NSF's seed fund approach, and I know someone asked a question about this. This is easily the easiest way for you to figure out if you're a good fit,
right,
amongst the spectrum of programs that are out there in the SBIR space. So definitely take advantage of it. If you have a question of like, hey, is there a place to go where people can tell us if we're a good fit? It's this thing. It's 1,000 words. It's the easiest like feedback you're going to get, and it's pretty turnkey.
Thank you. Thanks for the words of support. Yeah, the other thing about the project pitch that I think is helpful is oftentimes we get people saying, okay, well, I'm not sure I'm a good fit, and also I don't even know who to talk to or where I fit. The project pitch is intended for you to not only get a feedback, but if you are invited based on the fact that we think you might be a good fit, we tell you exactly, this is the topic, this is the area of NSF, and this is the program director who you need to ask if you have questions. And so that way you get both of those real common early questions answered. So that project pitch, if you're invited, will be an invitation to submit a full proposal for phase one. The full proposal is not lightweight. It is a pretty traditional government document. It takes a fair amount of time to fill out. It is, I think, customized in language that many of you as entrepreneurs will understand. I don't think there's anything there in terms of the content that is extremely unexpected, but it's got a lot of extra forms and things to fill out. And that would be something where you can submit at any time, but there are windows every few months that you can target that kind of give you the fastest turnaround. And you're welcome to start reading about that full proposal now, but if I would recommend, if you haven't gone through the project pitch, not spend too much time on it. The website that we have, seedfund.nsf.gov, is the best place to kind of learn about all of these steps. But those are the two steps. The full proposal has the disadvantage of taking a long time. It takes, after you apply, 5 or 6 months to get a final decision. So it's not a fast process. And I don't recommend your company sit around waiting. We can usually work with you if you've kept moving during that process. If the process results in an award, then you basically have access to the funding as soon as we decide. So that gap is very small, but the decision time is fairly long. And the reason that is because we bring in external experts, both on the technology and science side, and from the startup and the venture side, to give you feedback on what we like and don't like about what you're doing, and to give the program directors guidance and advice. And we also do our own diligence for a lot of companies that are competitive, engaging with them directly, which is why this process takes a while. But yeah, so if that goes well and you get an award, then you would have access to basically almost all that $275,000 on day one of the award, and a fairly flexible grant that you can use to kind of do R&D to move your product forward.
Awesome. And to be clear, because there's a lot of grants, there's a lot of different ways grant money is delivered. With the NSF SBIR program, this is delivered as a kind of like upfront lump sum, or does it work on like a reimbursement schedule?
It's upfront. It's in advance. Is the best way to think about it. It's not delivered. It's made available to you in kind of an account at NSF. The entire amount is locked down and kind of held aside for your company, but you don't have to draw it down at any given time. So it's kind of like a one-way ATM through our systems that you can draw down as much as you need before you need it usually, and you can kind of draw down whenever you need more. You come back and draw down more. So I think the funding and the conduct of the projects under our program is actually a much more pleasant experience than the application for the project, I would say.
Yeah, 100%. And I just want to speak, I brought that up just because there are just so many different programs out there. As entrepreneurs, I know there's some folks who've worked with different areas of the government where it's on a reimbursement basis, you know, having to get funding to like float the capital out front. It can be complex. And so I just wanted to make clear for all the folks on the call that one of the reasons we love NSF Seed Fund program, and highly recommend, if you're a good fit, that you consider engaging with them, is the fact that you get the funding, it's available to you, and you can really leverage it to your advantage instead of having to think 3 or 4 steps around, like, all right, how do I actually utilize this capital? There's a high level of utility with the NSF grants that I think doesn't always exist in other programs, just because there's been a good amount of streamlining of this process, which is really great.
We actually had to rebuild our award because we are funding startups, and the traditional awards that NSF uses just didn't work for those companies. They didn't have cash flow to support it. They didn't have the systems to support it. So we've kind of designed a lot of parts of our program to reflect where all of us come from, which is from the startup environment. So we have, for our phase 2, we have the only, it's a technical term, we have the only fixed amount cooperative agreement that exists in the federal government. We created that with other people from the government helping us so that we could serve our community, because nobody else in the government has ever built an award, in the federal government has built an award specifically for startups. So yeah, there's a lot of parts of our program that we've tried to customize toward that specific audience, and sometimes we're successful and sometimes we still have work to do.
100%, and that's just the nature of the beast in terms of government, for sure. But really do appreciate the utility and just the purpose-built kind of design of this program. One last question I wanted to throw out there, and then we'll get into all of the questions. NSF is notoriously competitive. It is very popular for all of the reasons we've described here. I wonder if you could speak to a bit of just like how competitive, like what sets companies apart a bit from the pack, and maybe any thoughts you have on how to deal with rejection from the program.
Sure. So we are, I think, the most competitive of the big SBIR agencies. The phase 1 success rate, the project pitches actually, we're pretty loose on that. We try to invite anyone who might be close. So we invite well more than half of the project pitches that are submitted. The phase 1 proposal, which is the second step, is something where we fund between 10 and 15% typically. So it's 1 in 8, 1 in 7, something like that. So it's definitely competitive. And the reason that is I don't think we're looking for anything. I mean, the technical piece is hard, right? If your company doesn't have that, it's very difficult to create it, right? If either you've got it or you don't, depending on what your company was built to do. That part is really mostly what kind of separates that 1 in 7 from the other 6 who don't get funded. But the best thing for people to do beside that is under your control is to basically build your company in a way that is customer focused and aggressive about commercialization, right? There are a lot of government grant programs and funding programs where they not only will allow you, but they actually kind of encourage companies to continue to get funding from the government year after year, and that makes sense in a lot of cases. That makes sense depending on what the government is looking for. If they're looking for a stable long-term supplier, they're going to provide awards to a given company lots of times. We don't do that. We rarely fund a company more than once or twice. And the reason that is because we're looking to help support you as a temporary partner on your path to having a commercially focused business. And you could be selling to the government eventually, but you're not selling to us. We're not buying anything from you. So we need to basically, there's no reason for us to support you after a few years typically. And so the best thing, I think, to your point, Sadell, about what they can do to differentiate themselves is make it very clear to us that they are viewing the program in that way, and they're viewing the government as an investor of a sort, and that their focus is on solving an identified, validated problem in the market that they're targeting, and that they're doing all the right things commercially to build that commercial case.
Awesome. That is an incredible answer, and I think everyone on the line who's considering applying would do very well to consider that, because it gets at the heart of we work across a lot of spectrums and support a lot of different programs through the OpenGrants platform, and it is just so critical that you as applicants and people who are applying understand the motivations behind the agency who is funding you. And I just want to bring up, there's another very popular SBIR program through the DoD that I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with. And the DoD pipeline is very much about selling to the DoD. It's not about this kind of investor almost relationship that NSF has. So it's really important to key in on these things and understand the motivation behind the agencies and what they're trying to accomplish with their capital. Last question, then we're going to get into all of the great questions that y'all are submitting. Thank you all for using the Q&A. Feel free to drop other questions in there at this point as well. But last question is, there's a kind of, when you submit information to NSF, you either get accepted or you get rejected. There's some feedback there. Does it make sense to reapply if you've gotten rejected? Does it make sense to just give up and go another direction? How do you deal with that? Or what thoughts do you have about how startups should deal with that feedback and rejection?
Well, I mean, if you're a startup, you should get used to feedback and rejection. I think that's kind of part of the contract when you sign up to be an entrepreneur. So, but to be less flip, I think to your question, one thing I would say is that you do get feedback at every stage in this process. If you don't get funded, especially if you submit a full proposal, which is a significant investment of time, if you don't get funded, there will be written comments from our external reviewers, anonymous. But I would also encourage folks to reach out to the program director and who actually brought those people in, who talked to them in most cases and ask them questions, and get that take, because you might get a more comprehensive kind of holistic sense of the reasons for the declination there. And the program directors we have, again, we've all been startup founders and investors typically, and so we understand and are very eager to work with entrepreneurs. That's kind of why most of us took this job. And so I think I would give folks that advice as a first step in trying to approach this question about whether they come back. I think as far as whether people should reapply, you're always allowed to reapply. That's always allowed. You have to go through both of these steps again. Typically, I think the reason for getting to the real reason that you weren't funded is really important making this decision, because there are some things that you can absolutely work on and figure out and address, and there are some things that you can't, right? So the issue of technical risk, if your product is already working, there's really no way to go back to technical risk. And I mean, you can try to find a new product, but again, we're big fans of people and companies focusing, and so if your product is past the point where you know how to make it work, you probably don't want to be doing R&D. I mean, that's our funding is just maybe not the best fit for you. And so there is a time and a place for this funding. And so if that's the reason you weren't funded, there may not be a path forward to being successful the second time. If the issue is like, look, we don't think you understand who needs this and who your customers are and what they care about, then customer discovery could absolutely get you into a place where you'd be successful the second time. So I think really understanding almost always when you don't get funded by us, it's not just because you wrote the wrong things in the wrong way. It really is that there's some part of your company you need to work on to get to the place where you're competitive. And so if you feel like that's a worthwhile use of your time and you can really address whatever that issue is, then we do have a lot of companies that get funded on their second or third try. I will say as one final point here, I think this is very different from most agencies. Most of the companies we fund are submitting their first ever proposal to NSF. So the majority of companies we fund have never submitted a proposal before the one we paid them for. And I've never seen a stat like that in other agencies. I don't think that's true for anywhere else. So we're not looking for, one of my colleagues, Anna, she says this is not a proposal beauty contest. And so we're obviously looking for you to communicate well. We're looking for you to, be able to tell a story, but we're not looking for people who are experts in government funding. And so I think for people to understand that, we're not looking for perfect. We're looking for entrepreneurs who inspire us, right? That's kind of the play. So hopefully that gives some context about how we think about these proposals.
Yeah, no, that was great. And I think, the one thing I want to highlight for everyone on the call too, Ben mentioned like reaching out to the program officers. I mean, those folks, not only are they like here to work with you, like the NSF's program is different in a lot of sense. And I think one of those things is just like the motivation behind these folks. We've found the program officers through SBIR to be incredibly helpful on a variety of projects, everything from, fast lane broke, or there was a natural disaster, or like there's all kinds of things that come up in life. And I just want to throw that out there that like the program officers can be incredible resources for you and your company. So develop a good relationship there. Definitely reach out and get feedback about why something happened. And they can also be a great resource in just like helping you, putting in a note that like, fast lane broke, so we're okay with you submitting this, or like doing this resubmission because, the platform blew up or whatever. Right. So great stuff. We're going to dive into some of the questions here. There's a lot of great ones. I know we've answered a lot of different things. There's a few that are going to just kind of like combine together. But the first one here, there's a question. Hey, we submitted our one-page proposal. Are there examples? Well, the whole question is, we're developing software to solve business problems, see it working for many industries. How can we communicate this clearly in a way to demonstrate that it's researchable? But I think like the core of the question, the ask is, are there examples of proposals that we can review? And I assume I mean successful proposals.
Yeah, so we don't provide sample successful proposals for either of these two steps. For project pitch, we don't provide an example of that, and we don't provide a full proposal example. We do that because we really, really don't want to tempt you to follow a cookie cutter that maybe is not the true intent of your business. Like, we really want to understand we're trying to align ourselves with your vision as a company, not vice versa. And if we give you any kind of template, the worry is that you're going to try to fit yourself into that container, and it may not be a good fit for your company. We're trying to be open and inclusive to let as many different companies in as possible. So we don't have that, but I understand why people would want that document. And so I will say that your dealings with NSF will be private up until potentially you get an award from us. And then if you do get an award from us, there will be some basic information about the project we funded in the public domain. Everything the government pays for, there has to be public record. And so you can go to our website and you can look up 3,000 companies that have gotten funded by us over the last decade. And we list contact information for all of our awardees. That's, again, part of the government rules. And so if you really need to see a full proposal, maybe you can get one of those people to give you their proposal. I did that when I was funded by this program, and we were applying when we were starting our company. And I got a colleague from grad school to give me their proposal, and I shared my proposal with others after we were successfully funded. So there's a lot of people out there who've been funded by us, and entrepreneurs typically like to help each other, and so maybe you can get a proposal that way. That's the best I can do for that question.
No, and it's a great response, and I'll just say that the links to the NSF site are on the in the chat there. Yeah. I think you can find past awardees by a simple just scrolling down on the homepage, and it's right there, and you can get right into it. Find someone.
Oh, yeah, Kate posted the actual direct link to the portfolio. Thank you, Kate. Yeah,
perfect.
That's great.
There you go. There's a question here about application deadlines. I'll just say, refer you to the website. Check that out. It's rolling, but there are windows. This is a great question. Would love to know if anyone without who doesn't have a university partner can work on an SBIR NSF grant. And so I'd love to hear your feedback on this. I think I know how to answer this, but I would love to hear your thoughts on SBIR and STTR, and if those distinctions are active within the NSF's seed fund.
Sure. Let me work backwards there. So STTR, you just mentioned, Sadale, that stands for Small Business Technology Transfer. Don't ask me why that's what it stands for. I didn't decide the acronym. And that is a program that basically you don't need to worry too much. It's a program that basically mirrors almost everything I've said today applies to that as well. It's a second program that we work for. It's smaller, and there are some differences about the practicalities, but fundamentally all the philosophy is the same. So you don't need to worry about the difference at NSF. Other agencies will have more differences between these programs, and you'll have to worry about which is a good fit. You never actually need to even worry about which of these is a good fit until later, because they're actually part of the same process. And the big thing with the STTR program is that it does require that a university is part of the project. And the SBIR program, you can work with the university, but you're not required to. The question about whether you can work, I'm not sure if this question is an eligibility question about whether you're allowed to work on a project with that university partner, or whether there's some, criteria that we want to see university partner. But I would say the answer is that there's not necessarily any reason you have to be working with the university or have any university connection for our program. A lot of new technology that has high risk does spin out of universities in some form. So a lot of our projects do have connections. Like people are technologies from university, or people have just graduated from university, and that's fine. But there's lots of other great innovations out there that are technical, where there is no necessarily university connection. I had a phase 2 company I worked with once, where there's no university, and the PI, the guy who was a technical expert, didn't even have a bachelor's degree, and he just happened to be extremely good at building high temperature furnaces. And so he got funding to develop a furnace that could process certain metals that were difficult to process better than could be done before. And so I think, we try to be open to innovation that comes from anywhere. Sometimes the technical risk and the innovation you're working on is in a field where, certain university training is very common to make you, like, if you want to do genetic engineering, you probably learned that at a university, right? There's not a lot of other places where you can do that. So sometimes there are a lot of our portfolio companies that have university connections, but I wouldn't worry if you don't. I would, again, focus back on the risk and the innovation that we talked about.
Awesome. Thank you. That was a great answer. Another great one. What is the benefit of working with a consultant versus applying on your own? Does NSF approve or disapprove of doing that? So this is an interesting question, given that I'm here on
with an opportunity, with an invitation from a service provider. I would say I don't blame anybody for working with a service provider because of how opaque this process is. I think we're a little better, but I think we still have challenges, and I think other agencies are very difficult to navigate. So there's absolutely a need for people to help you with the process. And so I think we have no problem with getting help. I will say, at NSF, because we are so different and because we have the same name as other agencies that have a very different focus, there is a risk that people misunderstand us, even service providers. Occasionally we see that where people are given advice that actually is not really as relevant for us as it would be for somebody else. And so because we're a little bit of an outlier, we are a little bit worried about that. But I would say, I think it's fine either way. I would say the one piece of advice I would give is if you do work with somebody to help you with the proposal, make sure your story is still there. What we really want to hear is from the people who are going to push this company uphill for the 8 years or whatever it is. We want to understand what they're trying to do, what their vision is, and what their mission is. And so if you have someone working on massaging the document, make sure that your own personal voice as the entrepreneur or the team of entrepreneurs doesn't get lost in that massaging. Awesome.
Thank you so much. There's quite a few questions. If you could just speak briefly to what, in terms of eligibility, if you're a foreign company, can you participate in this program, and what are the restrictions?
So let me cover a couple of things about eligibility. Number one is that, to apply, to get funded, you have to be a US-based small business. So to be the applicant, to be the company leading the project, you have to be US-based, which means, number one, you have to have at least a place of business in the US. Number two, you have to be US-owned and operated. And US-owned and operated means 51% of your stock or control and your equity, those things all have to be controlled or owned by US-based individuals, which means citizens or permanent residents. So it's really about your cap table and who actually makes company decisions, and the people who do that. And so for a foreign company, typically a foreign company could not apply, but a foreign company could theoretically work with an American small business and receive funding. The other eligibility thing I'll talk about here is that typically all the funding that we provide has to be spent inside the United States. So if a foreign company was part of this, their work would have to be done by their employees while in the US, typically. There's rare exceptions to that, but Congress is pretty strict with that requirement that's imposed on the program. So typically, again, US individuals have to own a majority of the company, control a majority of the company, and the work has to be done here in the US.
Awesome, thank you. There's also quite a few questions just around kind of the judging process, like how are program directors selected? How do they pull in experts? If you could talk a bit to that, that'd be great.
How are program directors selected? Was that the question?
How do they select like the outside
reviewers? Yeah.
What does that process look like in terms of
Sure. So there's a section on our website about reviewers, about the review process that I recommend for more information. But basically, when a full proposal comes in, we have three kind of criteria we judge you on. One of them is called intellectual merit, but that's actually a term that I would just think about this technical innovation and risk piece. Basically, is the innovation real? Does it have disruptive potential? Do you have a team that kind of can carry out the work, and this is the right people in the right technical field? So that kind of thing about the research that's going to be done. That's what intellectual merit is. That's the first piece. The second piece is what we call broader impact, which is basically, if this technology gets to market, if this product, exists, like what benefits does it have? And there's a third criteria called commercial impact. So this is really about beyond the commercial and the economic impact. What are the broader impacts? Is this helping? Is this product going to help clean up the environment, educate the next generation, things like that? Is the company going to be a net positive force for America, right? There's some products that are actually probably harmful to the general taxpayers. And then the third thing is commercial impact, which is kind of what an investor would look at a startup and think about. And so when we're putting together these reviewers, we're really looking at getting people who have expertise in understanding those three things, right? So the technical risk and innovation, the commercial impact, and the kind of broader impact on the domain, right? So the types of people that we bring in, they're all from outside of NSF. Again, for the technical side of things, it's typically scientists and engineers, technical people who understand the research. Next thing is the broader impact, and that typically has people who understand the market you're going into, right? Which is maybe different from the scientific personnel, people who understand what the impact will be and what the dynamics of the market are and how it's going to change the facts of that industry. And then the commercial side of things, we bring in typically people who know startups, and that's usually entrepreneurs or investors. So those are kind of the types of people we bring in, and we have a lot of freedom to bring in whoever we think is going to be well versed to comment on a given proposal. And in many cases, I'll bring in reviewers just for one proposal, right? That's actually pretty common for my portfolio. I just need one person who's an expert in. I have a company right now developing a new kind of elevator, so I had to figure out, okay, who designs skyscrapers? And so I had to figure out, okay, who can I talk to about that? So that's a big part of our job, and we're really trying to just get people who know more about one part of your business model that you're touching, one part of your stakeholders than we do.
Awesome, very cool. Thank you for that. Another great question, and I think there's some related ones about this. Can you speak a bit about like the reporting process for once you have your award? What does that look like? Is it a lot of time? What goes into that?
The formal reporting is pretty lightweight. It's fairly easy. And so the formal requirement for phase one is really only happens at the end of the project. There's no other formal requirement. So you have to basically send in a kind of a summary of what you did at the end, and you have to send in a one-page summary for the public about why the taxpayer investment was a good thing to have. And so that is, I think, that can take a little while, but that's the only formal reporting requirement for that phase one. Informally, a lot of the program directors like to be in kind of fairly constant contact with all of you in a fairly lightweight way, in a fairly non-burdensome way. And so typically like a 15-minute phone call, or maybe you send them one slide every month or two, something like that. That's not a formal requirement, but a lot of us find that it's really much more helpful for us to have those conversations every so often. And if you need help, obviously we're always there to help out if needed. But even if not, we want to understand how you're thinking about things, and the best way to get that is to talk to you about it every so often. And so that's not a requirement, but obviously if your program director wants that, usually it's something you want to do. And so sometimes you'll have that, but I think that is typically, a kind of half hour per month type of time commitment. So it's not too bad.
Awesome. Yeah. A couple rapid fire ones that I'm pretty sure I know the answer to as well, but I'll throw them your way. Do you only fund companies? What about nonprofits? What needs to be like? Is it a Delaware C Corp? What do y'all fund entity-wise?
Only for-profits are eligible. This is a legislative requirement. We can't change it. It could be anything that is a for-profit small business. And so we fund a lot of C Corps, we fund LLCs, we fund some S Corps. We can fund sole proprietorships. We fund, B Corps now, some of them. So anything that has a profit motive that is a small business, which by the government definition is fewer than 500 employees. Although the average company we funded phase one is 2 employees. That's the median size of company.
Awesome, thank you. Can awarded funds be used on compliance studies? For example, EPA required scientific testing.
Maybe. That's something you'd want to talk to the program director about. Typically, the phase one has to have some aspect of work that's actually moving your product forward, where the product is changing and improving and being proven out over time. But some of the funding could be used for testing and evaluation, and some of that could actually be things that also feed into regulatory or compliance studies in some cases.
Awesome. Great. There's some questions here about just generally speaking, like where your company should be in its life cycle. Should you have a patent? All these different things. Can you talk a bit about like where the team and company and tech should be? Like, do you need revenue? Those kinds of questions.
Yeah, I mean, so usually it's hard to be too early for us. Almost all the companies we fund, this represents the first institutional funding of any form. As I mentioned, the median company we fund in phase one is 2 years old, 2 employees, and has had no prior government funding. That's a very common profile. None of those companies have revenue, recurring revenue. I guess some of our companies are going through incubators and accelerators, and that's all good. But Product revenue is typically pretty rare because, again, unless you have a different product, the one that has the high risk that we're looking for, it's probably too risky for anyone to pay for yet. So usually to the extent that our companies have funding, it's usually sweat equity, founders shares, maybe some angel funding, or other kinds of incubator pre-seed type funding.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Another great question here. If there's a good fit between NSF's SBIR program and NIH, and we'll just expand this to DoD and everyone else in the SBIR, is it advisable to apply to and receive funding from multiple agencies? Is that legal? I know all these. I know these answers as well, but if you could speak a bit to how you might navigate that as a company.
Sure. So the legal and eligibility and kind of formal requirements about applying for multiple projects is that it's never illegal to apply to multiple agencies as long as you disclose to each of them about everybody else. You can't accept funding for the same project or for overlapping projects from more than one agency, but you could theoretically accept two different projects that are different projects from the same agency or from different agencies. As far as kind of navigating that, it's true that a lot of because we have a topical focus that is basically infinite, right? There's no technical topic we don't support. We overlap with, I think, every agency, and our portfolio companies have probably been funded by every other agency. We are the only agency that I know of that's really startup focused, and so usually we go before the other agency, maybe at the same time, but it's pretty rare for you to go to any other agency, get funded, and then come to us 3 years later because, number one, if that agency, if you're 3 years done, you're probably not as much of a startup anymore, and especially if the other agency funded you, because a lot of other agencies don't fund startups as much. Also because, again, we're looking for that high level of technical risk, and if you're working on this product for 5 years and you've still got technical risk, there's a few things that could mean, and none of them are good, typically. And so, it could be a company that's been around for a while. Maybe you change what you're doing, and so now you've got a new thing that you just started working on, and it's still risky, and that's fine. But usually, because we're looking for companies to focus on doing one thing well, and because we're looking for high technical risk, if you're doing one thing well and it's still risky, it usually means you're just getting started. So that typically means NSF will typically be the earliest agency to approach, but not always. And there is a lot of overlap, right? So with NIH, for example, we have, out of our 12 program directors, 13 now, 5 of them are focused on the life sciences, and the entire portfolio of all 5 of those colleagues could probably fit somewhere at NIH. So there is a fair amount of overlap, and it's usually not a problem to go to. Usually our window closes first, I would say, as far as your company's availability. And so I would encourage you, if you're approaching any other agency, to approach us at least as early, if not earlier than them.
Awesome. Question here, will the NSF participate with other investors? Thoughts on like outside capital and other folks joining in?
Sure. Yeah, so we don't, we're not an investor per se. We don't take equity share. We don't take board seats. So we're non-dilutive, and you guys should appreciate that. Hopefully that's a good thing. And so we don't participate in the sense of, actually being part of a transaction that another investor might have. I will say that for our phase 2 companies, if you get phase 2, which is $1 million award, we have a program called phase 2B, which actually gives you the opportunity to match outside funding, especially investment or product sales, up to another $500,000. So if you get a phase 2, you get $1 million. Say you raise $1 million of venture investment or seed angel funding, or convertible, maybe even a convertible equity or safe note. We will then match 50 cents on the dollar up to another $500,000. So now your $1 million phase 2 award will become $1.5 million. And so we do encourage people through that mechanism to raise funding. So usually if you've raised some money, that's a good thing. It validates a lot of the things that we're looking for. It gives you more support, so you're more likely to be successful. There is an amount of money you could have raised before you came to us that we start to be a negative. And we want our funding to be catalytic. We want our funding to be transformative for your company's trajectory. And so if you've raised $1 million, that's fine, usually. If you've raised 200,000, that's fine. If you've raised 5 million, it's starting to be the case where we're going to ask ourselves, like, why is my $275,000 phase one going to make a difference here? And so there is kind of a double-edged sword to external funding. But the way I think about external funding is this: when people say, we want to know how much external funding we need to raise before we start being before that starts to be a negative, and I say, look, if the amount of money you can raise is going to be negative for NSF, you should just go raise it anyway, because it's much more important than, right? So like, if you need to ask the question, you can't afford it anyway, basically. So I would say, like, we're hoping that the companies we're working with are not going to dramatically change their fundraising or other plans for us. We're hoping to, again, be a part of your story, but we're hoping that you're not building your company around our funding, because our funding is only ever going to be part of your funding landscape, because we only pay for one thing. We only pay for R&D. So we hope that you view us as one piece of a puzzle to support your company.
Awesome. Love it. We have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to blow through some pretty rapid fire ones.
I'll be fast now. I'll try to stop talking as much.
No, this is all great, but I want to be cognizant of other folks' time as well. So I just want to throw out there, this will be available as a recording afterwards. Definitely reach out. We're happy to be a resource, and let's go. So is there an advantage to having a university a partner? Does that make you more competitive?
If the work you need to do is going to be better done with a university partner, then yes. But per se, there's no advantage of having a university partner, right? But sometimes with a startup, you don't have all the equipment and expertise you need. As I mentioned, most of our companies are around 2 employees. That's common. That usually means you can't do everything you propose to do technically within your own facility with your own people. So having a university can be helpful there, but it's not a checkbox we look for. If it's the right tool for the job, then it's great. Otherwise, it's fine not to work with one.
Awesome. Can you receive funding from more than one startup?
Yeah. So I mean, certainly we look at the unit of organization we look at is a company, right? So each company has a separate, we look at them separately. If there's people who are overlapping with multiple companies, then those different companies can all apply. We would start to ask questions about, if people have 3 different jobs, we start to ask questions about the team, right? Any investor would say, look, if my CEO has a day job, how much am I going to get enough time to make the company successful, right? So there are those questions that would be asked, but yeah, somebody could theoretically be part of 2 companies that both received parallel awards.
Awesome. And another question here, any opportunities for funding post-quantum cryptography projects?
Sure. Yeah, we have a full quantum information technology portfolio. Peter Atherton, he's actually funded some of the leading companies in quantum, including the current longest coherence time for quantum computing is a company called Atom Computing, I think, and they're a portfolio company of ours. So yeah, I can't remember the name of it. We have done some post-quantum cryptography. I just can't remember the names of those companies. But if you talk to Peter, he'll be able to give you more advice.
Awesome. And I just mentioned in chat, reaching out to anyone within this program, go to the NSF site. Contact information is all there. The links are there in the chat. One last one here. Does NSF refer projects and applications that they don't fund to other agencies for funding?
We would theoretically talk to people in that, when there's that debrief call, if you don't get funded and you want to talk about why. A lot of times that's a common question that comes up, and we're happy to try to give you ideas. We don't ever release any information that you send to us to anybody outside of NSF for any reason. It's all kept private, so we could tell you about another agency, but we couldn't tell them about you, right? Because unless we somehow you had your permission to do that in a way that didn't reveal proprietary information, right? But yeah, all of us here have worked with other agencies, and so sometimes if you want to just think about, we don't know the whole government; it's a big government, but if you want to understand opportunities, we know a lot of the people in the research space for companies.
Awesome. Well, Ben, thank you so much. This has been incredibly enlightening. I hope this was useful for everyone on the call. We will be following up with emails with links to all these resources. If we didn't get to your question, feel free to reach out with any specific questions to myself or Ben. And you can go to the NSF site. All of the contact information, like I said, is there. Highly encourage you to reach out to these folks. They're incredibly approachable, very responsive, just a great agency to work with in general. So we're big fans at OpenGrants of what y'all are bringing to the table. and really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone. Well, thanks for being here. Thanks for sticking with us. You can visit opengrants.io. The links to NSF are right there in the chat, and we'll see y'all next time. Thank you.